Hello. We are going to have a quick little APUSH review session, and I'm going to try to keep it as quick as I can and really just hit some of the highlights of each time period as well as the key concepts. So first period was 1491 to 1607, 1491 because it was the year before Columbus arrived in America, and 1607, the settlement of Jamestown. So in the first key concept, and I would encourage you to take these key concepts and turn them into thesis statements and see if you can then respond to them. And if that's the case, then you know the content. So as native populations migrated and settled across the vast expanse of North America over time, they developed distinct and increasingly complex societies by adapting to and transforming their diverse environments. So part of it is also picking out what is the key thing that this is talking about. It's talking about native settlements, and it's how they adapted to and transformed their environments. So I'm going to come back to this in just a second, but can you give examples of those different Native American populations and how they are working with the environments that they're given? Key concept 1.2 was contact among Europeans, natives, and Africans resulted in the Columbian Exchange and significant social, cultural, and political changes on both sides of the Atlantic. So here is a one-pager kind of giving some of the highlights of period one. So as I previously mentioned, Native American tribes adapted to their environment and housing, how they gathered food and culture. So think about examples such as the Southwestern tribes that are living in this hot desert climate. How are they adapting? Well, one of the things that they're doing is irrigation so that they can grow crops. A second thing is how their housing is structured to live in a very drought type of environment, such as the adobes that are created. Where you move then on to the Great Plains, for example, and they're nomadic because they don't have a lot of resources. And so they build houses that are pretty much easy to take down and put up, like teepees. And then as you move across to places like the New England area, then we have much more permanent housing, but we also have some kinds of temporary as well, because there are some hunter gatherers, but there's also, remember, the Three Sisters farming where they grow corn, beans, and squash all in one plant. So those are the kind of things that I want to encourage you just to quickly review with regards to that bullet point. The second bullet point is the arrival of Europeans brought about the Columbian Exchange. I've given you the definition here, the intentional and unintentional exchange of foods, animals, and diseases. And this brought about significant changes. So think of some of those examples that I gave, such as the fact that the horses brought up, they were able to allow Native Americans to more easily hunt. Think about how, though, cattle, for example, are going to trample crops and they're going to eventually have to enclose them. Think about the fact that diseases are going to be brought unintentionally, and it's going to wipe out 90% of Native Americans. And then think of foods, such as how the introduction of the tomato is so influential in the diet of Italians and how it's going to increase the life expectancy and just the health of Europeans. So that's what it's talking about. Then remember also there's significant debate over how to treat Native American peoples. And the Valadola debate between De las Casas and De Sepulveda is this issue of whether or not it's appropriate to enslave Native American peoples, and how De Sepulveda says absolutely, these are people that are lower. I'm not even sure they're people, and look at how little they know. Whereas De las Casas says no, they're just humble, innocent people, and they deserve to be free. And then we can also look at the ways that the Spanish when they came to the United States, well, it wasn't the United States yet, but when they came to America, how they first initially practiced the encomienda system, where they were given land plus Native Americans, and they were supposed to Christianize them in exchange for getting the natives to work the mines and the fields, and how eventually, because of the Valadola debate, it's going to change to a much nicer system where they have freedom as long as they live within mission systems, for example. And how the mission system is ultimately going to lead to some conflicts. I labeled two of them down at the bottom, the Pueblo Revolt and the Battle of Acoma, that you can go back and look at, but also how Spaniards, unlike the English, are going to intermarry and intermingle with natives and Africans to create these new races, the mestizos, who are European and Native American, mulattoes, European and African, and Zambos, African and Native American. Moving on to period two, which was the founding of Jamestown in 1607 through the beginning of the French and Indian War in 1754. Notice that the key concept talks about developing a variety of colonization and migration patterns. They have different imperial goals, and there's also the different North American environments where they settled and how that's going to make a difference in what their economy and their demographics and everything is like, as well as the fact they're going to compete with each other and American Indians for resources. Then also how the British colonies are going to participate in political, social, cultural, and economic exchanges with Great Britain that encourage both stronger bonds but also resistance. So let's look at some key things. Knowing that the British, French, Spanish, and Dutch had different goals for colonizing, which will lead to different treatment of Native Americans. So, for example, we already know that the Spanish intended to Christianize, and so they're going to bring Native Americans into their culture and try to Christianize them and try to make them more like them. The French are also going to send out missionaries to do the same thing. Both the French and the Dutch have an economic motive of trade, and so they're going to form trading relationships with Native Americans. But for the most part, the British have no interest in creating relationships with natives, and so they're going to do everything they can to force them off their lands through a series of conflicts, including the Anglo-Powhatan Wars. It's also important to know that New England, the Chesapeake, Southern, and Mid-Atlantic colonies all had different social, political, and economic development based on who was there and the geography. So looking first at who was there, the fact that in New England, and to some extent the Mid-Atlantic colonies, had more families. They came for permanence and as a result, establish communities and towns that had churches and governments and social structures, whereas people that came to the Chesapeake and the Southern colonies were primarily interested in profit. They're going to be growing large cash crops like tobacco and indigo and rice. They're not going to be very many women of any kind or children. It's going to be mostly men. And so that's how the demographics are different. And as a result of that, they're also going to eventually bring in slaves to work those fields where New England really doesn't need it. And that goes with geography. The fact that there are long, harsh, cold winters in New England make it virtually impossible. Plus, the soil is bad to do anything near the mass farming that's going to happen in the Chesapeake and the Southern. And because it's hot and humid there and the soil is rich, they are going to have that crops and need extra labor, which leads to slavery ultimately. The economy of the Chesapeake as a Southern, as I mentioned, relied on slave labor, which also leads to a difference in social because of the fact they're going to have social structure that includes the rich, well-to-do plantation owners at the top, followed by those whites that don't have slaves, such as yeoman farmers, and ultimately at the bottom, would be African Americans. Also, the fact that religion was central to New England. We talked a lot about the Puritan faith and what it meant, and how, even though both they and Maryland were founded on the idea of religious tolerance, that it really meant religious tolerance for people like them. And then we also see the beginnings of democratic forms of government emerge with the House of Burgesses. Moving on to period 3. The first key concept is that, 1754 is the beginning of the French and Indian War, going through 1800 and the election of Jefferson. British attempts to assert tighter control over its North American colonies and the colonial resolve to pursue self-government lead to a colonial independence movement and the Revolutionary War. 3.2, the American Revolution's democratic and republican ideals inspired new experiments with different forms of government. That would lead you to talk about the Articles of Confederation as well as the Constitution. And then finally, 3.3, migration within North America and competition over resources, boundaries, and trade intensifies conflicts among people and nations. So looking into that period of time following the election of George Washington, when we have conflicts, not only with Native Americans, but also with other nations. So some of the major concepts from this time period include the French and Indian War that is fought. It's going to leave the British in a lot of debt. And they're also going to be concerned about conflicts with future between colonists and natives. As a result, they're going to enact these taxes to get money out of the colonists, but they're also going to impose restrictions such as the Proclamation of 1763 and restrict movement. They're also going to end salutary neglect, which was this idea of kind of hands off, where the colonies were able to develop on their own without really too much interference from the British. Once this happens, obviously they're going to have a revolution that they win. Following the revolution, we will experiment with government. The Articles of Confederation will be purposely designed to be weak, but it will prove to be just too weak and ineffective, even though there are a couple of shining positives, including the Northwest Ordinance and the fact that they were able to end the American Revolution and get a treaty signed. They ultimately can't do a lot of things, such as coin money or raise taxes or even raise a militia. The Constitution will then be created to rectify that and make it a strong national government. Even though it included many compromises in there that we also discussed, it is going to be something that will then be going to ratification of the states. And during this ratification period, the anti federalists are going to be the ones who say this is not acceptable. They want the Articles of Confederation style government. They don't want a strong national government. They want strong state governments. And their debate between them and the Federalists, who want the strong national government, is going to lead to the adoption of the Bill of Rights being added in order to try to tamp down that extra government control that they're afraid of. And these same concerns exactly will later materialize in the Democratic Republican Party. So you see this thread, even though they're not the same, the anti federalists ideas are ultimately going to materialize in the Democratic Republicans. Political parties will be created based on the different views of America that Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton had for where we should go as far as manufacturing and farming and who should rule and things like that. Also, disputes over Jay's Treaty and the French Revolution, whether or not we should support the French in their revolution, ultimately lead to the creation of these political parties, with the Democratic Republicans being that government is too excessive, following Thomas Jefferson's views, and the Federalists, not to be confused with the earlier Federalists, who are going to be the party of Alexander Hamilton, who support a strong national government. They support a national bank and manufacturing and debt being okay and things like that. One of the reasons that there was such a conflict with Jay's Treaty was the fact that the British remained in Western forts despite this Treaty of Paris in 1783. So Jay is sent over to get a new get some concessions out of the British, and ultimately they say, well, okay, we're sorry, but they don't say they won't do it again, which leads to continuing problems that we'll see in period 4. And I also forgot to mention here that we do have problems at the same time with the French, including things like the XYZ affair, which will ultimately lead to a breakdown of our alliance that we had. And this will lead to the election of 1800, which is considered the first peaceful transition of power between one political party to the next, and it will end in 1848 with the Seneca Falls Convention. Concept 4.1 is the United States begins to develop a modern democracy and celebrate a new national culture, while Americans sought to define the nation's democratic ideals and change their society and institutions to match. 4.2, innovations in technology, agriculture, and commerce powerfully accelerated the American economy, precipitating profound changes in U.S. society and to national and regional identities. And 4.3, the U.S. interest in increasing foreign trade and expanding its national borders shaped the nation's foreign policy and spurred government and private initiatives. Here is our one-pager for period 4. The age of Jefferson leads to more expansion. We acquire the Louisiana Purchase. There is a powerful court in the Marshall Court that really continues the Federalist platform well after the Federalist Party dies out, and foreign problems that ultimately will lead to the War of 1812, including the impressment of sailors, the fact that the British remained on the Western forts. This will lead to the Embargo Act, where we shut down all trade completely, and then slowly creeping into trying to solve it, but ultimately getting the War of 1812. Then we have the Age of Jackson, which expands democracy as more men are allowed to vote, leads to conflicts over tariffs, with the conflict over the tariff of abominations with South Carolina in particular, almost threatening to secede from the Union, and then Jackson's attempt to destroy the Bank of the United States, as well as his passage of the Indian Removal Act, and then it will also usher in a market revolution. Jackson will defy both Congress and the courts on multiple occasions. During the market revolution, which, remember, trick is what this one is for, textiles, railroads, iron, and coal, a transportation revolution also occurs at the same time. You could say that they really go together, and one would not be possible without the other, because canals and railroads increase the speed and efficiency of travel. They also create a national market for goods. Also in the market revolution, we see the massive amount of new inventions, which are going to make life much more different. It's going to industrialize the nation, and people will begin moving to cities as opposed to staying on the farms. We also have some immigration during this time that are Germans and Irish, which will lead to a rise in nativism. And then there's a second Great Awakening religious movement that leads to an era of reforms that talks about abolition, women's rights, temperance, education, and more. Moving on to period 5, it starts in 1844 with James K. Polk's presidency and really is signifying the idea of westward expansion, and ends with Reconstruction, the end of Reconstruction in 1877. The United States became more connected with the world, pursued an expansionist foreign policy in the Western Hemisphere, and emerged as a destination for many migrants from other countries. It 5.2 intensified by expansion and deepening regional divisions. Debates over slavery and other economic, cultural, and political issues led the nation into civil war. 5.3, the Union victory in the Civil War and the contested Reconstruction of the South settled the issues of slavery and secession, but left unresolved many questions about the power of the federal government and citizenship rights. Manifest Destiny is one of our main topics in period 5. This includes the acquisition of the Oregon Territory, the area of Texas, the Mexican Cession, and the Gadsden Purchase, all during this time. The Mexican Cession, as well as the acquisition of Texas, led to a renewed conflict over the issue of slavery, as the question became whether or not slavery should exist in those territories that were acquired. And so that increases the sectional tension that already exists. And there's a number of different things that we talked about, including the Compromise of 1850, the Kansas-Nebraska Act, and all of that is as a result of it. Finally, it breaks down completely. The Band-Aid approaches no longer work, and the Southern states, upon the election of Abraham Lincoln in 1860, leave to preserve the Union, to preserve slavery. Lincoln is going to try to preserve the Union at all costs, and eventually, after a 4-year war, he will succeed. And there were arguments against slavery that were led by abolitionists such as Frederick Douglass. You could also add Harriet Beecher Stowe in there. Southerners are going to respond with ideas that slavery is a positive good. John C. Calhoun said that, as well as even George Fitzhugh saying slaves are better off than Northern factory workers. After the long Civil War, we have Reconstruction that temporarily increases the power of the federal government, particularly in the South, in the lives of people, and is going to lead to some protections of Blacks for that time period, such as the Freedmen's Bureau, maybe even some political rights that will be exercised for a short time being. And you'll have some Blacks in Congress for the first time, as well as it alters race relations. But we know this all ends in 1877 when the KKK and Black codes and everything are reinstalled once the federal troops leave. In addition, in the Reconstruction era, and during the Civil War, because it's only a Republican government, that is going to lead to a number of acts being passed. To help Blacks, the 13th Amendment, 14th Amendment, and 15th Amendments will be added to the Constitution. I gave you free citizens vote, which is 13th ends slavery, 14th grants citizenship to all people born in the United States, and 15th Amendment gives all men over the age of 21 the right to vote. And then the Freedmen's Bureau was originally designed to give everyone 40 acres and a mule. It's not successful at that. However, it is successful in education and some other things. Which brings us to period 6, which starts with the end of the Civil War, the beginning of Reconstruction, and goes through 1898, which actually begins imperialism. It's the Spanish-American War. And 6.1 talks about technological advances, large-scale production methods, and the opening of new markets encouraged the rise of industrial capitalism in the United States. 6.2, the migrations that accompanied industrialization transformed both urban and rural areas of the U.S. and caused dramatic social and cultural change. And 6.3, the Gilded Age produced new cultural and intellectual movements, public reform efforts, and political debates over economic and social policies. And then we have massive immigration that will lead to industrialization and urbanization. Industrialization, which in this case is ROSE, which is railroads, oil, steel, and electricity, will include attempts to create monopolies and trusts to help these business tycoons consolidate power, including the railroads. These business tycoons will be debated whether or not they are robber barons or captains of industry. The workers and the farmers will both fight back against these big businesses, the workers through forming labor unions and the farmers through populism. There will be a second wave of reforms that will occur during the Progressive era, these including trying to fix living and working conditions as well as corruption in government and in business. You will have a debate over how to best help African Americans between Du Bois, who wants immediate action right now, and Washington, who says segregation is okay, let's just focus on education as the key. And then the American West will be settled and Native Americans will be removed. I talked in the videos about the ways that they would try to assimilate them through the Dawes Severalty Act and the Carlisle Indian School, and ultimately the bison will also be destroyed. And that is the end of the review video. I know it was quick, I know it was short, but these are just some major key points. And I think if you watch this and do a quick little review, you'll be fine on the multiple choice.